Could you tell us some of the exciting moments of your life?
Well, yes, of course, the excitement of being part of birthing two children, that's always going to be the most important days. But I think if I'm reviewing a historical trajectory, certainly April 27, 1994, when South Africans were allowed to vote in a democracy, one person, one vote. And then a few days later, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as a president, May 11, 1994. Those are days that are just so strongly in my memory. I worked in his office shortly afterwards. I wrote the first white paper, the policy paper for the South African government. And working in Mandela's office under J. Naidu, the Minister of Reconstruction Development, that was very exciting too. I could begin to feel some of the tensions and contradictions as we were just writing down the kinds of plans and projects. And the problem was, of course, the balance of forces had been adjusted to get rid of apartheid. That was very, very important. But what was exciting was I could already tell that the contradictions in that project were going to be met by resistance. And it wasn't more than days after Mandela was elected that you could feel a rumble of confidence on the ground, anger and pent-up frustration. And so people started to protest. And they were continuing traditions of protesting apartheid, but it took on this amazing new feel, a class struggle, a gender struggle, the anti-racism still very strong, ecological consciousness rising. And it wasn't simply, we're all united against apartheid. Now it became complex and interesting.
Then, before that, what were you doing?
Well, I had worked for the previous 5 years in Johannesburg. I moved there in 1990. And between 1994, I spent in an NGO. That was an opportunity to go to all of the townships in the Johannesburg area and all the way up to the Zimbabwe border, the Mozambique border. The organization was called PlanAct. So I was very lucky because it allowed me as a technical assistant to the civic movement, the urban social movements, especially SANCO, South African National Civic Organization, where I helped their leader, Moses Mayakiso, with the drafting of the preliminary policies of the government, the Reconstruction Development Program. So I worked as a technical aide, and before that I was finishing my PhD work in Zimbabwe. And I'd moved there from doing my doctorate with David Harvey at Johns Hopkins in 1989. Before that I'd been raised as a student, not very well educated, in Alabama in the United States, and I was born in Northern Ireland. So that was my trajectory. It was working through, especially in the east coast of the United States, a radicalization that many people in the 1980s were the beneficiaries of anti-apartheid organizing. And in my case, probably the most important, aside from David Harvey, my supervisor, was Dennis Brutus, the great poet, who was a sort of anti-apartheid hero and was one of the first to make the links between anti-apartheid and global justice and to bring the movements into alignment.
So you were born in Northern Ireland?
Yes, and my father moved because there wasn't much to do for an engineer, so he worked on the space program and helped put astronauts and the sort of moon rockets and landings on the moon and satellite communication. So from a background in a small city where they were actually designing the moon rockets in Huntsville, Alabama, my education was mostly in economics and then eventually political economy. I studied at Swarthmore College in Philadelphia and for a while studied at the Wharton School, and I realized my professors there didn't understand the two big dilemmas of the time in finance. One was the third world debt crisis, which broke out in 1982, and the other was the redlining, the urban disinvestment and blight. So I was looking for a PhD where I could study uneven development and unevenness as a system, not just as sort of accidents or market failures, but as structured mode of capitalist accumulation and class dynamics. That was best pursued at Johns Hopkins with David Harvey. Neil Smith had been there as a great theorist of uneven development. So I was very lucky to get into that program and worked there until I moved permanently to Southern Africa.
your PhD was on Zimbabwe.
It was a study of the financial system, and if you look at a country using the banks as the sort of window and the contradictions therein, the personalities and the nature of crisis formation, you learn a lot. And this was a particularly good country because it was sufficiently small. I could read the entire literature about the country, but especially the tracing of flows of capital over space and through sectors and what it did to society, that prepared me for looking at then the next challenge for me, a broader South African reconstruction after apartheid.
But then your